For 12 years, he moved through the suburbs of California like a ghost. He broke into homes in the dead of night. He studied his victims for weeks before he struck. He knew their routines, their schedules, their vulnerabilities. He would sometimes call them on the phone beforehand just to hear their voice, just to know they were home. He committed at least 50 rapes. He murdered at least 13 people. He operated across 10 counties spanning the entire state of California. And for 40 years, through the most intensive cold case investigation in California history, he was never identified until 2018. When investigators finally put a name to the man known as the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, what they found was more disturbing than anything they had imagined. He had been a police officer. The crimes began in 1974 in Visalia, California, a series of burglaries and a murder that investigators would later attribute to the same man. But it was in 1976, in the suburbs of Sacramento, that the pattern that would terrorize California for over a decade truly began. He became known first as the East Area Rapist. He targeted women in their homes, sometimes when their husbands or boyfriends were present, binding both victims and forcing the male partner to lie still while he attacked. He was methodical and controlled. He wore a mask. He spoke in whispers. He threatened in specific terms that suggested he had spent time studying each household before he entered. Investigators noticed something deeply disturbing in the pattern. He knew things he should not have known. He knew when people would be home and when they would not. He knew the layout of houses he had never officially entered. In several cases, neighbors reported a strange man in the area in the days before an attack, someone who appeared to be surveilling properties. By 1979, the attacks had escalated. The East Area Rapist had moved south, and he had begun killing. In Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, and Orange County, couples were murdered in their homes in nearly identical fashion. Law enforcement in Southern California was looking for a different killer than the one investigators in Sacramento were tracking. They were the same man. The last confirmed attack attributed to him was in 1986. Then he stopped, or at least, he appeared to stop. The Golden State Killer investigation was one of the longest and most complex in California law enforcement history. Part of what made it so difficult was the sheer geographic scale. 10 counties, multiple law enforcement agencies, each one initially treating their cases as separate. It took years before investigators began connecting the dots, recognizing that the East Area Rapist of Sacramento and the original Night Stalker of Southern California were the same person. DNA evidence had been collected from crime scenes across the state, but without a name to match it to, the DNA profile sat in evidence rooms for decades, a perfect genetic fingerprint of the killer with no face to attach it to. Investigators developed a detailed psychological profile. He was organized, intelligent, physically fit, and had law enforcement knowledge. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence, he knew investigative procedures, and he knew how to move without being caught. The profile pointed strongly towards someone with a law enforcement or military background. In 2001, journalist and author Michelle McNamara became obsessed with the case. She spent years researching it, communicating with investigators, and building her own investigation. She coined the name Golden State Killer, the name that stuck. She died in 2016, 2 years before the arrest, never knowing who he was. In 2017, investigators made a decision that would change this case and cold case investigation across America forever. They turned to genetic genealogy. The technique works like this. Take the unknown DNA profile from a crime scene and upload it to a public genealogy database, a database where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their own DNA for ancestry testing. Search for partial matches. Even a distant relative sharing 20% of the killer's DNA is enough to start building a family tree. From a partial match, investigators build outward, tracing family trees, cross-referencing with public records, birth certificates, death certificates, census data, marriage records. They narrow the tree down until they find a branch that fits the profile: male, the right age, living in the right geographic areas during the attacks. The process took months. The family tree built from the Golden State Killer's DNA eventually led investigators to a single name: Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo was 72 years old. He lived in a suburb of Sacramento, and he was a former police officer, having served with the Exeter and Auburn police departments in California during the exact years the attacks were occurring. He had even been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting, caught stealing a hammer and dog repellent from a drugstore. The same year, the East Area Rapist attacks had slowed significantly. To confirm the match before making an arrest, investigators needed a fresh DNA sample from DeAngelo himself, obtained without his knowledge or consent through legal means. They followed him. They waited, and when he discarded a tissue outside his home, they retrieved it. The DNA matched perfectly. On April 24, 2018, law enforcement descended on a quiet suburban street in Citrus Heights, Sacramento. Joseph James DeAngelo was in his driveway. He was arrested without incident. A 72-year-old retired police officer taken into custody 40 years after his first confirmed murder. The shock of the arrest reverberated across California and across the country. Survivors of his attacks, some of whom had spent decades living in fear, wondering if the man who had destroyed their sense of safety would ever be found, learned the news and felt something they had stopped believing was possible. An answer. In court, DeAngelo was a startling figure, frail, hunched, sitting in a wheelchair. It was almost impossible to reconcile the elderly man in the courtroom with the athletic, controlled predator who had terrorized California for over a decade. In June 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of rapes. As part of a plea agreement that avoided the death penalty, he received 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing, survivors and victims' family members were given the opportunity to address him directly. One by one, they stood and spoke to the man who had taken so much from them, who was finally sitting in front of them with no escape. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo did not just close one of the most notorious cold cases in American history. It opened a new era of criminal investigation. Genetic genealogy has since been used to solve dozens of cold cases across the United States, rapes and murders that had sat unsolved for decades, with victims' families who had given up hope of ever seeing justice. The technique has fundamentally changed what is possible in cold case investigation. It has also raised serious ethical and legal questions. The genealogy databases used in the DeAngelo case, GED Match and Family Tree DNA, were public databases that people had uploaded their DNA to voluntarily for ancestry purposes. They had not consented to law enforcement searches. The legal and ethical framework around this technology is still being debated and defined. But for the families of the Golden State Killer's victims, for the survivors who lived for 40 years wondering if he would ever be found, Those questions are secondary to the simple, overwhelming reality of what happened on April 24th, 2018. He was caught. He was named. He will die in prison. Joseph James DeAngelo was a police officer. He swore an oath to protect the communities he served. He used the knowledge, the training, and the authority that came with that oath to do the opposite, to identify vulnerabilities, to evade detection, to terrorize the people he was supposed to protect. The Golden State Killer case is ultimately a story about two things. The first is the extraordinary resilience of the survivors and the investigators who never gave up, who spent decades pursuing a man they could not name, who kept the cases alive when it would have been easier to close the files and move on. The second is the power of science to deliver justice that the law alone could not. 40 years of traditional investigation could not find Joseph James DeAngelo. A genealogy database and a discarded tissue did. He is 78 years old now. He will die in prison. The survivors who stood up in that courtroom and spoke directly to him got something that most victims of violent crime never receive. They got to see his face as he answered for what he had done. Do you think genetic genealogy should be used more widely to solve cold cases, even with the privacy concerns it raises? Drop your answer in the comments below.